Welcome to everyone. This is the PDD webinar series, and we're really excited. That is Sonia Busu, Danica Flois, Anastasia Deligiori, and myself as PDD co-conveners to launch this series. So basically, this is a series that comes out of the section that we planned for the PSA conference that should have taken place in Edinburgh in April. But obviously that was not possible for well-known reasons. So now we are having this webinar series, which is actually really great because we can include a lot of international people who might not have been able to participate in the conference as well. The series will consist of 6 sessions that will go over the summer. We have a break in August, but we'll be back in September. And yeah, we are really excited to discuss all these various topics on participatory and deliberative democracy. Please go to the PDD website if you also want to take part in the other webinar sessions. And you will find the full schedule there with all the sessions and a button to sign up for each individual one of them. And then you'll get the Zoom link for all of these as well. So a technical matter that I need to mention in the beginning, as I briefly mentioned already, we are recording this session because obviously we want to make this accessible to as many people as possible, also the people who cannot make it right now. So we'll be recording this, putting it on YouTube and on our website, and we'll be sharing this on social media as well. Now, obviously we need your consent for this. So if you're not happy with being filmed, if you're not happy with being in this recording, just turn off your camera for now, and you can always still contribute in the discussion by writing in the chat, and we'll have an eye on the chat as well, and get this content into the discussion as well. So I am going to chair this, and Sonia is going to have an eye on technical issues, and I think she will mute you all so that we don't get any feedback or any unwanted noises during the presentations. And you can always unmute yourself if you want to say something urgent, or obviously if you want to contribute to the discussion.
Hans, you muted yourself.
Sonia, did you mute Hans?
I think I did. Right.
Okay, I unmuted myself and it muted me again. So I hope I'll stay unmuted now. Okay, no worries. So now comes the welcome to this particular webinar. We start this series with this webinar on the question, Quo Vadis, radical democracy. So where are you going, radical democracy? This is a panel that Danica and I put together for the PSA conference. Obviously, Danica will have a lot to say on this as well, and can contribute here in the discussion later. Our interest in the question was that we looked at the development of this term radical democracy and saw that it made quite a few changes. In the beginning, where it was popularized, probably was very closely related to agonistic ideas of democracy, but there's a greater differentiation now. So radical democracy has become more of an umbrella term for different aspects of democratic theory or different strands in democratic theory. So today we are particularly interested in the question, how radical is deliberative and participatory democracy, but also agonistic democracy? Obviously, how does this relate to radical democracy? And then also in which futures will these discussions develop, and what does the future hold for radical democracy? So we'll briefly present our 3 fantastic presenters or speakers in this webinar. We're really excited to have William Smith, who is Associate Professor at the Chinese University of Hong Kong with us. For Will, it's 8 in the evening, so maybe not the most convenient time, but he just said he's happy to talk in the evening. So that's, we're very grateful for that as well, of course. We have Amanda Machin, who is Professor at the University of Witten-Herdecke in Germany. Markus Holdo from Uppsala University in Sweden, and Andrea Felicetti, who is Assistant Professor at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Italy. So as you can see, it's a very international bunch, not just the audience of this webinar, but also the presenters, which we are also, of course, happy about. Just a quick word on the procedure. Each speaker will get 12 minutes. We'll try to keep this rather short. After 10 minutes, I will try to give a decent sign. I'm already apologizing basically for interrupting and just saying that 2 minutes are left. We will hear these presentations back to back. And during the presentations, you can always contribute by asking questions in the chat. So if you click on the chat function, you can posit your questions there. And later, Anastasia will read them out to the speakers. And after this round of written questions, we'll have a round of open questions where everybody can obviously contribute to the chat and so to the conversation with the video and audio. And of course, hold your questions for that, because also we would like to hear from you personally and have a diverse discussion. So that was all from me. Thanks all for being here, and I'll hand over to the first speaker, William Smith. Yeah, Will, if you can just come on.
Okay,
unmute yourself.
Yeah, am I online? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so this is a bit of a weird paper. It only exists because of the panel that you and Danica proposed. So you have to take some of the blame or the praise, depending on how this goes. One of the things that I've always found slightly frustrating about critical debates about deliberative democracy, and specifically the idea of radical democracy, is that this is always seen through the prism of agonistic democracy versus deliberative democracy. And I do respect agonistic democracy, and I think it's got some interesting things to say. But if you think about the history of radical thought, I mean, for me, I think about Marxism and anarchism. Those are the two major kind of political ideological challenges to the kind of liberal social democratic ideologies that inform deliberative democracy. So I thought it might be kind of interesting to take your proposal to look at this idea of how radical is, what is radical democracy, or how radical is deliberative democracy, and try and look at it from the light of anarchism. And that sort of sounds a bit arbitrary, but it's not. A few years ago, I gave a paper, I think it was at one of the PSA conferences or one of the Westminster conferences, that was looking at deliberation within social movements and the kind of deliberative practices that have been studied quite extensively by social movement scholars. There's quite a big literature on this. Now, if you look at what's driving the kind of deliberative practices that are employed within radical social movements, and I have in mind here the kinds of radical protest movements that coalesced around networks like ACT UP, and then the anti-globalization movement and Occupy. If you look at the ideological driver of that, anarchism is a really prime driver of what's going on within these movements. And I find that quite interesting. I mean, if you look at the way in which social scientists have studied what's going on within social movements, some of them have explicitly used deliberative democracy as a frame for understanding what's going on. And they've tried to say that if you look at the way these protest movements are organizing themselves and making decisions, are sort of getting people involved, deliberative and participatory democracy has quite a lot of resonance here. There's a great book by a sociologist called Leslie Wood, which is called, it's basically called Deliberation, Diffusion and Direct Action. And it's looking at the role that deliberation played within anti-globalization networks in North America. There's another big literature. And I think there's an interesting story to be told about why it is that, and it does seem to be anarchists within these networks, are endorsing and using practices that have a lot of affinity with some of the kind of ideas that circulate in deliberative democracy. So what I basically do in the paper is to use, copying basically Bao Guanhei and Mark Warren, who did a paper called Authoritarian Deliberation, which I think a lot of you will be aware of. And that was looking at the way in which deliberative ideas were informing some experiments within authoritarian contexts like China. So they came up with this sort of conceptual framework for trying to make sense of what's happening there. It's authoritarian deliberation and then deliberative authoritarianism, which refers to something sort of slightly different. And I thought it might be quite interesting to try and look at what's happening within radical protest movements through a similar lens. So I call the paper Anarchist Deliberation, and the paper is really just an attempt to map the deliberative practices that have been adopted, driven by anarchist ideology within radical protest movements. So anarchist deliberation refers to what's kind of going on here. In the revised version of the paper that I circulated a few minutes ago, I try to justify the use of the term anarchist deliberation by saying that if you look at these deliberative practices, they're informed by core anarchist values. And those core values are forgotten. Certainly one is prefiguration, one is freedom, and the other is anti-hierarchy. And this is sort of set out at length in the paper. And I talk a little bit about why it is that protest movements have developed these kinds of deliberative practices. One of the main reasons is that deliberation serves as a means of coordinating action in the absence of hierarchy. And then I talk a little bit in slightly more programmatic and normative terms about whether the kind of deliberative practices that you're seeing within these radical social movements might form the basis of a kind of deliberative anarchism. So kind of like the second half of the paper is really about whether there's some kind of a sort of interesting ideological variation of anarchism going on here, and what the sort of implications of that are. And I suppose, I mean, again, I'm not going to talk more about what's in the paper because I don't think there's time to do that. I'm just trying to give a very, very brief overview of what's in the paper. Going back to some of the motivating thoughts, one of the things I think that you can draw from the development of anarchist deliberation is the extent to which deliberative democracy is itself open to contestation. So I mentioned earlier that the main ideological drivers of deliberative democracy, I think, are liberalism and social democracy. It's a broadly progressive kind of centre-leftist movement. I think one of the interesting things going on at the moment is a contestation of that. You have anarchists coming along, appropriating some core deliberative ideas and actually reinterpreting them within a revolutionary insurgent context. One of the kind of interesting features of anarchist deliberation is that it doesn't look at all like what agonist Democrats say radical democracy looks like. And actually some of the anarchists who write about and reflect on what's happening here are quite categorical in saying that their project shouldn't be conflated with agonistic democracy. So I think that's kind of interesting. I think you can make a similar point, incidentally, about this interest in authoritarian deliberation and deliberative authoritarianism as well. I mean, there you have a movement which is driven, again, by a very different type of ideology, sort of Chinese Confucianism and even sort of CCP authoritarian ideology. So this suggests to me that deliberative democracy itself is actually potentially viewable as a very contested terrain. We tend to approach it very much as a liberal social democratic paradigm, but there are these very interesting attempts to really push against that, at least when you look at the practice. And to me, that is a slightly more suggestive, it's a more interesting debate than the more familiar theoretical arguments that you get with the debate between agonistic democracy and deliberative democracy. So listen, I'm happy just to stop there. I mean, the paper's 10,000 words. If anyone wants to read it, I've sent it to all of the speakers, and if anyone is interested in it, just reach out and I'll circulate it. But it's really just, I find it interesting that anarchists are doing deliberative democracy, and very few people who do deliberative democracy seem to sort of be interested in that. They're very interested in authoritarians and communists doing it, but not anarchists. So in a way, I'm just trying to sort of draw attention to what's going on and maybe think about some of the theoretical implications of that. So I think I'll just stop there. I think I've already been confused. This is my first ever Zoom presentation, so I don't really know what the hell I'm doing. So I'll quit now. and listen to what I'm sure will be far more professional presentations given by the remaining speakers.
Okay, thank you, Will. Thanks a lot. Well under time. This is good. So we have more time for discussion. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions. I have some, so I think this was a really, really interesting presentation. Lots of food for thought. So I'd like to hand over to Amanda Machin now for the next presentation. If you can just unmute yourself.
Thank you. First of all, can you hear me okay? I've actually got some building work going on in the background, so I do have a microphone and some headphones if I need to use them. But you can. Is there any background noise? Any buzzing?
Nothing for me.
I'm in my apartment building. They started this construction work in the middle of the global lockdown, which would only happen in Germany, I think. They can continue with the building work regardless. Anyway, I'm very glad to be here. Unlike William, my paper is not 10,000 words long. It's a work in progress. And part of the reason for that is, as usual, I'm very disorganized. And the other reason is actually I prefer to present papers that are sort of works in progress that I can get feedback on. So I'm really happy to have any feedback or critical comments either after the presentations or later if you want to email me. But the idea for this paper was really to move on from previous work where I've been considering why radical democracy might be a salutary alternative to dominant approaches to climate change. And what I want to do with this paper is to look at whether radical democracy can actually be seen, whether it can be actually detected in climate politics and what it would look like. So this is, rather than looking at why we need radical democracy, I'm looking at whether we have radical democracy, what if we do, what it's looking like, and what the possibilities are. So clearly, so this is what I'm calling green radical democracy. Clearly, climate change has become a prominent issue in the political realm. But very often, following the logic of ecological modernization or sustainable development, it's sort of it's failed to provoke radical change and has actually ended up supporting the status quo. So what I want to ask in this paper is whether something is changing. Theorists agree, I think activists agree, that the climate movement, which incorporates numerous actors and groups and demands, has grown over recent years to become internationally visible. And in September 2019, millions of people from 150 countries reportedly gathered for a global climate strike. And apparently climate strike has become the word of the year in 2019. In the paper, I want to consider two climate movements, Fridays for Future, a movement, as I'm sure you all know very well, but the icon of this is the 16-year-old Greta Thunberg, who undertook a school strike for the climate. And the other movement is Extinction Rebellion, but I'm going to focus today on Fridays for Future in particular. And what I think it's important to ask about these protests and about the movement in general is whether they really challenge existing power relations and the extent to which they're really able to reconfigure the political realm. Because they've been accused of being both saying too much and also saying too little. On the one hand, they're commonly criticised for promoting this bleak vision of catastrophe, which seems to kind of end up fomenting paralysis in a way. And on the other hand, it's also been, so in a way it's accused of saying too much. It's also accused of saying too little, and that actually it's deferring to experts and scientists and actually depoliticizing the issue too. So, the question I want to ask in this paper is whether, however, there's still the possibility for a moment of radical democracy, and that actually could provoke structural change. And I'm asking particularly whether it could be that a new collective identification is forming that can disrupt the political realm, reconstructing the demos and constituting a democratic moment. So I'm really focusing on the possibility of collective identification that can, as I'll explain in a minute, is very much how I understand how I understand radical democracy, is that it's very much circling around the formation of collective identifications and the struggles around collective identifications. So I will emphasize three dynamics, which I don't have time to go into today. First of all, the articulation of a new collective identification in connection with the climate crisis. Secondly, the emergence of passions within embodied climate protests that accompany this collective identification. And thirdly, the inevitability of exclusion from this identification. Okay, so what do I mean by radical democracy? And again, unlike William, I'm definitely sort of falling within the agonistic understanding of radical democracy. And I understand it not as the rejection of prevailing liberal democratic values, but rather the call for deepening and strengthening these ideals. Where radical democracy can be seen as departing from liberal democracy is in its claim that politics cannot be understood as liberals would have it, as the interaction between individuals with predetermined interests, who are assigned certain rights as equal members of a full and inclusive demos. For radical Democrats, questions of how the demos is composed, who is a member and what rights they are assigned, and what freedom and equality, these values of freedom and equality truly entail, are matters of ongoing dispute that cannot be solved through deliberation, however rational or inclusive. So whereas liberals suggest that democracy involves the political negotiation between interests of pre-existing differences, radical Democrats suggest that this negotiation should be seen rather as a political struggle that involves the contestation and construction of such differences themselves. So basically, whereas liberals see politics and democracy as about interests, radical democracy is about identities, regarded, as I understand it, as contingent and ambiguous constructions that are never fully complete and therefore can always be contested. And that's what democratic politics is actually constituted by, is this contestation between identifications. And an important point here is that these identifications are always constituted in antagonistic opposition to another. And I'll come back to that point in a bit. So that's what I understand as radical democracy, and that's what I say is potentially visible in climate protests and discourses. And what I am arguing is that the climate crisis, which is the word that's being used now, we don't talk about climate change, we talk about the climate crisis. It represents the disruption of the established social order, and therefore is provoking a repoliticization of environmental policy making. And it also works. So it's sort of, it's radically disrupting, if we take it seriously, our established ways of living, ways of consuming, ways of traveling. But what it's also doing, the climate crisis, is working as an empty signifier for the climate movement. By empty signifier, I mean that it's a radical other that's actually allowing a chain of equivalences to be constructed in opposition to the climate crisis. So what I'm doing in this paper is thinking about the discursive and emotional construction of a political identity in relation to this climate crisis, and that occurs throughout the various arenas of social life. And what I'm going to conclude, I know I'm already running out of time, but what I want to conclude is that that this radical, the climate crisis offers an opportunity for radical democracy, but there's also the possibility that it subverts that possibility too. So, and I want to basically claim that there's this possibility of radical democracy in the climate discourses, but that is threatened by other aspects of the climate movement too. So just to go very quickly through these three different aspects of the collective identification around the climate crisis. First of all, what we see in recent climate protests and movements is the formation of a political identity that takes the climate crisis as a common enemy and the source of numerous social, economic and political problems. And the climate crisis here means much more than climate change, but also much less. It means much more because it's a crisis not just of the climate, but it's a social crisis. It's an existential crisis that goes well beyond global heating. It's a sort of a looming catastrophe. And this is, as I said previously, it's disrupting the taken for granted social order. But it also signifies less than climate change because it's also, if we think about it, it's actually devoid of substantive meaning. It actually is a lack in the symbolic order, and that's why I'm calling it an empty signifier here. So to look at Fridays for Future, the climate crisis symbolizes the lack within society and politics, and they see it very much as the abdication of ethical responsibility by older generations. So
2 minutes. 2 minutes, all right?
Yes, yeah. And it's seen as a threat that means the absence of the future for younger generations. So it's working as an empty signifier which can construct a chain of equivalences in opposition to it. So the various different demands and groups have their own particular identities and differences, but they are equivalent in their opposition to the climate crisis, and that's how it's functioning in this in the climate movement. The other aspect is that of green passion, and that's something we see very, very much in the Fridays for Future movement and Extinction Rebellion. But when you see Fridays for Future activists speaking, they're crying, they're angry, there's a huge amount of emotion there, which is also working to construct collective identifications. And the other aspect is exclusion. And that's an important point, because the danger with this empty signifier is that it makes, it allows the extension of this chain of equivalences indefinitely, which ultimately means that there's no radical possibility left. So I argue that in order for this radical democracy to take hold, there has to be exclusion, ultimately an end to the chain of equivalences. So these are the dimensions of this collective identification, and what we see is that there's this real potential for radical democracy in climate politics, but there's also other aspects that are working in tension with that possibility. And I think that's something that we will have to see whether, which tendency plays out. But what's also very interesting, I think, with the Fridays for Future is that we see the appearance of young people who are disrupting the political realm by just appearing in it. People that can't vote, aren't given a vote, but are very much disrupting our understanding of who the demos is. And by just making that claim, regardless of climate change, that is in itself a very radical movement. So I think in that sense, Fridays for Future is already consisting a moment of radical democracy. I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Amanda. This was very interesting to hear back to back with Will's presentation on deliberative anarchism. So I think there are interesting questions also if you look at the papers together. But now I would like to hand over to our last presentation from Andrea Felicetti and Markus Holdo. So if you unmute yourself and launch.
Okay. Yeah, sounds good. Well, in the first place, let me take 10, 15 seconds, not just to thank you for this, but also to say there are so many friendly faces and the names of so many nice colleagues. It's a very good thing for me and for us, I think. We will be presenting a paper that the idea occurred to us during the lockdown, so there wasn't much to do here in Italy. Maybe in Sweden there was more happening, but we thought that since we both work on social movements, we could join forces and talk about social movements in deliberative democracy. So I will share some slides with you. Please just let me know if you can see them. Can you see?
Yes, we can see them.
Okay. There you go. Sounds good? Looks good?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. So essentially, Markus and I wanted to talk about social movements in deliberative democracy, which we do not claim is something necessarily new, but we want to shed a new light on this topic because from our investigations and from other people's work, we think it's about time to move forward. So essentially, social movements have been the object of growing attention in the field of deliberative democracy in the past, let's say, 10 years, even though they've been around for a long time, since the inception of, since the birth of the field, so to speak. And today, in the wake of the systemic turn in deliberative democracy, we tend simply to think of social movements as non-deliberative actors that nevertheless benefit the overall deliberation at the systemic level. We want instead to move towards a better recognition of the role and of deliberation in movements and the value of it. So just to recap the state of the art in democratic, so the topic of movements has been approached from different perspectives. In democratic theory, deliberative theory in particular, it's been an actor of interest for those scholars working in looking at the public sphere and working in a critical theory tradition. And most recently, in the wake of the systemic turn, there's been renewed attention to social movements. But the bulk of work on social movements has come from the field of social movement studies that has shifted over time from an attention to participatory practices towards a more deliberative understanding of social movements and their practices. Finally, in the last few years, I think some very interesting mixed analysis that draw both from deliberative democracy and social movement studies have been developed and are shedding developing a new understanding empirically and theoretically of the role of social movements, and I think we may develop an updated understanding of social movements. So, in order to do that, I will pass the word to Markus, that is specialized in this part of the paper in particular. So I will just click the button, Markus.
Yeah, thank you. So we focus on three stages of social movement action here, where we see a significant role for deliberation. So the first one is creating space for questioning, and we have in mind a process of bringing together people who feel that there is something wrong about the current situation, policies, and discourse. So in a situation where you don't necessarily have a clear idea what you want to accomplish, but you have an idea that there's something that we need to talk about. So in several theorists have argued that it is being part of public deliberation that makes it hard to question basic assumptions. So if you're part of a discussion, if you're part of a debate, you need to accept some basic terms, some basic assumptions, and so questioning becomes contradictory to that process, basically. So we have Chantal Mouffe, Iris Marion-Young, other people more recently that have claimed that in order to question, we need to withdraw and maybe protect ourselves from the norms of deliberation or the public sphere. We claim instead that that this is a bit of a reductive understanding of movements. So we claim that spaces for questioning are often spaces for deliberation. often we see social movements attracting people who are longing for a space where they can address important issues as citizens. Occupy Wall Street is a clear example, maybe the most recently most obvious example of that made deliberation a huge part of what the movement was all about. But Nancy Fraser has made similar arguments about feminist movements, that they attracted people who really wanted a sphere that was inclusive, where people were addressing each other as equals, and so on. The global justice movement argued that in order to accomplish change, we need first to establish an alternative public sphere. So that was stage one. We move on to stage two, coordinating collective action. And here, what we're talking about is this challenge of acting together when no commitments are binding. So most movements rely on people who in most cases are just there on a voluntary basis. They don't need to abide by decisions that they don't agree with. So Donatella Della Porta has identified this dilemma where she says that deliberation may, on the one hand, be an obstacle to getting things done. It takes time, takes energy, and it may get very tiresome for activists who want to accomplish things. But on the other hand, without deliberation, how can movements rely? How can people predictably cooperate when coercion is not an option? So there seems to be a trade-off here, according to Della Porta, between, on the one hand, efficiency or effectiveness and legitimacy, on the other hand. We claim instead that movements can increase strategic capacity and coordinate actions more efficiently and with greater effectiveness through deliberation. And so one case that illustrates this pretty well, I think, is the problem of the Swedish workers' movement in the 1930s, when they had this huge problem with workers going on wild strikes and using resources that were supposed to be meant for building this cohesive movement. So what they did was they relied on unhierarchical, leaderless study circles that made people part of the process of shaping the movement and at the same time coordinating action. So that made people more loyal to the movement and more predictable, perhaps, that they would abide by the decisions. We make similar claims about the civil rights movement that we unfortunately cannot go into now, but we have to move on to stage three. So engaging with mainstream politics. Perhaps this is the part that we think of most obviously when we think about movements in the public sphere. We are talking about raising awareness, affecting attitudes, contesting ideas, calling for policy change, all these things that could be outcomes of social movements or aims of social movements. At least in the deliberative systems literature, there has been this assumption that movements contribute to public deliberation through actions that are aimed to accomplish change, but they do not themselves deliberate, as Andrea said earlier. So the idea is that movements are not the typical actors that are respectful, sincere, public-minded, inclusive, and so on. They're not about deliberation, and we should not hold them accountable to such norms either. Because they are accomplishing good things in other forms of action. But we claim that that movements are often natural leaders that initiate and maintain public deliberation. Deliberation helps movements challenge the dominance of powerful political and economic interests that otherwise dominate, and they make room for reasoning as citizens with shared responsibilities. Instead, they are often met with an unwillingness to deliberate as well as violence. So in the paper we discuss the Hong Kong protest and Black Lives Matter is two of several examples of movements that try to accomplish deliberation, try to deliberate, put forward arguments that could be responded to in a deliberative manner, but instead they are met with an unwillingness and met often with violence. So over to Andrea again.
Yeah, it's over to me again. So essentially, we claim that the idea that movements are non-deliberative actors that nevertheless benefit public deliberation misrepresent essentially what movements are and what they do or should do. Essentially, empirically, we see that social movements do not put deliberation aside in order to contribute to the deliberative system. Rather, they might or may not use deliberation in order to achieve their ends or because they value deliberation as such. And also another point is that the idea that movements should not need to respect deliberative norms runs against the fact that many movements fight exactly to make public spheres and their discourses more inclusive, egalitarian, and respectful. So there is a problem there as well. And also from a more normative
2 minutes.
Sorry?
Okay.
Okay, from a more normative point of view, for deliberative democracy, it should make a difference if people act toward each other in ways that follow basic deliberative norms or not. And this is something that has already been pointed out in the debate, but we want to apply also to social movements. So we come to a question. Should deliberative movements be preferred to non-deliberative ones? Well, we respond, we are inclined towards a qualified yes, even though there are exceptions possible that have been discussed extensively, among others, by our confirm. So what we want to highlight is that deliberation offers a standard for evaluating movements. And this is very different, and it's independent from whether or not a movement contributes to achieve more deliberation at the systemic level on the one hand, and it's also different and independent from our preferences when it comes to the goals of a movement. So as deliberative democrats, we do not necessarily need to tie our view about movements depending on whether they pursue the same goals as us. As discussed by Markus, deliberation may play a significant role in 3 different stages of action. And at the same time, we claim, as deliberative democrats, that deliberation is intrinsically valuable. Therefore, in each stage of a movement that involves participants in deliberation, we prefer movements that involve participants in deliberation rather than not. And I'm heading towards the end. Here there are some points for normative discussion, and so these are very much being developed these days, so your feedback would be much welcome. When it comes to creating space for questioning, there are movements on the one hand that are mobilized through initiatives of political and economic elites or grassroots activists with very predefined objects, and on the other there are movements that make room for deliberation and question the status quo, affirming commitments to critical reflection, inclusion, and equality, and we deem the latter preferable to the former. When it comes to coordinating collective action, well, this can be achieved by means of domination, whereby activists put up with strategic choices that come from above in the name of their shared commitment to the movement's goal. And this is very different from a movement that allows room for deliberation, even when it comes to tactics and strategies, the latter being preferable. Finally, when it comes to engaging with mainstream politics, we are, as we already mentioned, open to the possibility of violating norms of deliberation. Nevertheless, this does not mean that the deliberative principles do not apply. We deem that violating the basic norms of deliberation is always wrong, but might be justified. But in that case, the burden of proof falls on the violator. And there should be no expectation that because violation happens, then there is no value to deliberation in movements. And then a very basic but heartfelt thank you to all of you for your attention from Markus and me.
Thank you very much both for this presentation, which I thought added another interesting layer to the debate. Maybe if you stop screen sharing.
Ah, yeah, you're right.
Then we can move back to the discussion together. So basically, in the meantime, I think we've collected quite a few written questions in the chat. And for this, I would hand over to Sonia, who will read these questions out and share these questions with you. I would suggest to collect all questions together if that is possible and do one round of answers so that it doesn't take up too much time, so that we still have time for an open discussion, and we will try to finish in about half an hour. So that's the time left for discussion. Sonia.
Yes. Yes, hi everyone. So there were a number of different questions for each of the speakers. So if we start in order, I would say we start with Williams. And Nivek Thompson asked which anarchists are doing deliberative democracy in the real world. And Gavin Parker asked about the distinction to be drawn between who is deliberating with whom, and so different contexts where power relations are being negotiated or even reinforced. And Graham asked about the conceptual overlapping between deliberative approaches to deliberative democracy and perhaps philosophical anarchies like Robert Wolff. There's a number of other questions for Amanda as well. So Marit Hammond asked what kind of collective identity is being constructed, and whom the climate movement might, how the climate movement might subvert the prospect of democracy. And she also asks whether the empty signifier actually can mask exclusions, and what impact that has on democracy generally, or just radical democracy. And there was also a brilliant question from Ian Flynn for William, that I would invite Ian to ask himself, because it's extremely long as well, so I think it'll be a good contribution to give. And then a couple of questions for Andrea and Markus as well. So what is the role of solidarity on effectiveness of social movements against the background of global transnationalism for shaping change? And is it possible to have a global radical democratic movement as well? So these were some of the questions that perhaps we can start with, and then I would invite Ian Flynn to ask his question specifically to William, because it was a particularly interesting one as well.
Okay, Will, do you want to go first and answer the questions? I think you need to unmute yourself.
Right, sorry about that. Thanks very much. It's really wonderful being able to see the questions. I mean, if only conferences were like that, that would be great. Yeah, in terms of the real anarchists doing deliberation, you can actually trace this quite a long way back. I mean, Habermas has a very brief discussion of anarchism in Between Facts and Norms, and he traces it right back to the 19th century and locates deliberation within anarchist experiments of council democracy. You can certainly see something like it in Spanish anarchism, although it clearly wouldn't have been theorized as deliberation at that point. I think the point where anarchist writers and activists themselves start talking about what they're doing in explicitly deliberative terms, I mean, I think that's probably around about the time of the 1970s anti-nuclear movements, and particularly the anarcho-feminists who were very sort of pioneered a lot of the initial discourse surrounding what I'm calling anarchist deliberation. And then it flourishes in successive decades, if you look. I mean, the unifying thread is these are all direct action movements. I mean, these are all movements that they're not just protest movements, that they practice a specific type of protest, which is, again, this specific idea of direct action. And deliberation is the mechanism they use to coordinate what they're doing and to basically mobilize and organize. And I think that Marco and Andrea mentioned Occupy as a kind of culmination of that. Interestingly, with Extinction Rebellion, you're seeing a little bit of a step back, I think, from what little I can gather of it. I mean, Extinction Rebellion clearly is not an anarchist movement, but it does have anarchist participants who are quite sort of doing quite a lot of work behind the scenes. And that's quite interesting because they're dropping things like consensus and some of the other paraphernalia that have been adopted up to and including Occupy. But I think it's really, when I talk about anarchist deliberators, it's the participants to radical protest movements that use direct action, who often either self-identify as anarchists or who don't identify as anarchists because they don't want to offend the non-anarchists who are participating in the movement. So those are the real anarchists doing deliberation. I picked up a question, Graham's question about Robert Wolff. One thing I think, it's a really interesting thought. I did find when I was doing a little bit of research into it that within anarchism, there's a kind of divide between individualist anarchism, which is very much, I think, the animating spirit of what sometimes gets called philosophical anarchism, and what is sometimes described as social anarchism, which is more orientated towards the activist wing of anarchism, basically. And it seems to me that it's the social anarchists who are doing more in terms of both theorizing, but more to the point, practicing anarchist deliberation. So I'm not going to say that the sort of individualist anarchism has absolutely no role. I'm sure it does. But I have kind of noticed that there is this division within anarchism. And there are quite a few anarchists who are very hostile to people like Robert Wolff, interestingly enough. They're not hostile, but slightly ambivalent. And I think that ambivalence comes from the perception, might be a mistaken perception, that Robert Wolff represents a kind of individualist philosophical anarchism that a lot of activists kind of want to move away from. I think that there was another question before Ian's, but maybe it's better that I just stop because I've already spoken too much, and I know that Ian's going to ask his question and I'll have a chance to come back. So I'll stop there and move on to Amanda.
Okay, sure. Amanda, do you want to unmute yourself and address the question?
Okay, yeah, I agree. It's wonderful being able to read the questions a few minutes before you have to actually answer them. So Marit's questions, what kind of identity? So she says, yeah, what kind of identity is being constructed in climate politics? Well, that's what I was trying to refer to when I was talking about the problems of this chain of equivalences, because on the one hand, it's a very inclusive identification because a number of different groups with very different demands, you know, all the way from climate justice and post-colonialist demands to kind of just basic recycling and collecting up plastic are kind of being connected up in this collective identity. But that's what I'm saying. The danger is that if that becomes too broad an identity, and other theorists have done work on this, and it ultimately becomes, it doesn't mean there's no radical change because it includes all different demands, including this kind of ecological modernization that we can just have economic growth and keep everything the same. So that, I don't know if that answers the question well enough, but that's how I would understand it. It's a sort of balance between being inclusive enough to build enough momentum, but not being totally universally inclusive. And then the question she asked, how might the climate movement subvert the prospects of democracy? And what I was talking about then was really this problem with the climate crisis that, and no one seems to, I mean, I'd be interested if anyone agrees with me here, but the problem with calling something a crisis is that it securitizes climate change. And there's obviously all this work on securitization that it ultimately depoliticizes, and it takes things out of normal politics or you know, the realm in which we can disagree into this kind of state of exception, and that's the danger, I think, with this discourse of around the climate crisis. And also, and this is what I was speaking about at the end, is this other tendency we have in the climate movement, and I'm talking more about Extinction Rebellion, I suppose, is this deference to experts and to elites, which is really interesting too. And I haven't fully kind of worked out where I position myself here, but it's interesting that there's this continual deference to elites and the facts and the truth, whereas for a radical democracy you would think that they would be challenging who gets to say what the truth is, who gets to say, we're challenging the very sort of order of the elites. And also, and this is where I'd be interested to hear what you think, Mara, is obviously citizens' assemblies, which this was a discussion we were supposed to have in Dublin, I think, earlier this month, and we didn't. But yeah, this whether citizens' assemblies are ultimately a problem in reducing the possibilities of radical democracy to take place in various parts across society, rather than in this kind of one institution. So I'd be interested to hear what Marat has to say about that. And then the question from Elliot about what role does radical democracy have for communities on renewable energy developments? And I think that really depends on the particular development. But I think and I maybe switch more to agonism here, but I would say that it's what's important here is the formation of a new collective identification that doesn't include everyone, and that only by creating this strong collective identity do you have a possibility for real change. And that's, yeah, I think that would be various different political issues, not just renewable energy. But again, I'd be interested to hear what you think. And then the question asked by Lucy: what is the what consequences should my paper have? What do you think is the most important consequence of the work you've presented? What would you like to happen as a result? Well, I think what I'm always worried, actually, as an academic, being asked to sort of give kind of practical recommendations. But I think what I want the climate movement to be aware of, or people, or our environmental activists to be aware of, is this danger of appealing to consensus, appealing to rational deliberation, when actually what we need, and what I think is more productive, is actually a passionate formation of collective identifications that doesn't include everyone, and it can't include everyone if it's going to make any sort of substantive radical change. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Amanda. So just before I hand over to the last presentation, the last set of questions, before we go into the open discussion, a couple of people have raised their hand already, and I've taken note of this. So after this, in the open discussion, I will just go through the people in the order how they raised their hand. So if you want to participate, you can raise your hand by going at the bottom of the screen on participants. You get a list of participants, and on the bottom of this list, it has a button that says raise hand. So you can raise your hand, and I can easily follow who wants to ask a question or make a comment, and I'll make a list, and we just have one round of comments and questions later. And now I'll hand over to Andrea and Markus for the last couple of questions that are still open.
Yeah, we actually had a couple of questions, so that's perfect. I'll take one, and it's the one about the role of solidarity on the effectivity of social movements against a background of global issue and need for transformation. Well, what I can say is that initiatives of solidarity are a huge part of contemporary mobilizations by social movements. These take different forms. One of the most observed is direct social action, so actually doing things that benefit often local communities. And there are studies that highlight how local solidarity initiatives, for instance, present challenges between the social and the political goals of movements action. On the one hand, movements would like to solve problems experienced by certain groups, from a social perspective. On the other, they would like to push political institutions to do that. It shouldn't be the movements taking care of citizens, or not movements only. So there is a clash there. There are people that join a movement just because they need their services, the services they're providing at times of hardship. For instance, there was a lot of that going on in the city of Rome during the lockdown. But these kind of dilemmas are dilemmas that you can either figure out by means of deliberation or by means of top-down organizing. So there lies an interesting challenge for movements and for us. But definitely solidarity is a key dimension of contemporary mobilization. I hand it over to Markus.
Yeah, so the question about whether radical democracy movements could be transnational, I was unsure if it was a question for us, but I will take it as a question for us at least. I think that it speaks very well to several of the movements that we discuss in our paper. And I'm not sure what is the best way to answer this question, but I do think that if you think about the challenges today that movements are facing and that they are taking on, I think that in many cases they are transnational, global problems even, and so it makes sense that in order to really confront these issues, movements would need to be transnational. So the global justice movement was one case where you also included deliberation that was transnational, and there are several other cases as well. And I think that when we see this, especially from the perspective of deliberation, it can sound almost naive to think that we could have some kind of transnational global process of deliberation. But I do think that we can see a lot of potential for that in movements that have existed and that exist today. So we can take a little bit of that potential and try to work on that. Yeah, that's just a spontaneous answer. But thank you very much for all the questions.
Thanks a lot, Markus and Andrea. Okay, so let's open for a round of questions. I have a list here. If you still want to, share a thought or ask a question, go to participants at the bottom of your screen. Click there. You'll find the list of participants, and at the bottom of this, you see the raise hand function. So if you still raise your hands, I can still put you on the list. For now, we have 5 people: Ian, Oliver, Michael, Danica, and Dimitri, and we'll go in that order. So Ian, please. You need to unmute yourself on the bottom left if you want to speak with us. Is Ian there? Or maybe because he just posted the question, he just wrote the question. So
we still can't hear you, Ian.
So maybe in the meantime, while Ian is figuring this out, should we move on to Oliver's question then?
Okay, I think I might still, Ian's question, my question kind of goes in the same direction. But so I've got 2 points. I don't know if there is a question behind them, but let's see. The first is a reaction to William. And I agree. I mean, one of the most surprising things for me is, kind of seeing how this field has evolved is to see how little connection there is to anarchism, which is, to me, where refigurative practices started, but foreground anything that comes after, the participatory and democracy movement in the 60s, and then the deliberative turn in the 80s, 90s. So, but what I would say, William, the surprising thing to me, you said there is the agonistic wing, and then the deliberative wing, and then you focused on examples of anarchist interventions that are, at least for, a big part of them are agonistic, and you left out what I think that anarchism has been doing deliberative work for centuries, which is, and now the reception of that is embedded in community ownership programs, in the urban commons, the social commons, the digital commons. all sorts of social enterprises, the social economy, the community economy. That's the space where anarchist practices use deliberation in everyday governance, and not just the kind of, occasional gatherings of Occupy or more ad hoc types of movements. So yeah, but to me, this goes to the fundamental point that sometimes we are confusing. I mean, deliberation is a form of communication, and it can happen in all sorts of spaces. And it's just too quick. We make the leap, and deliberative democracy, is just one model of democracy that takes deliberation to a sublime kind of space and makes it the ruling kind of practice. But it's just one amongst many practices, which kind of takes me to the other point I wanted to make to Andrea and Markus. It kind of feels that you feel that you need to make, or look at social movements through the discipline of deliberative understanding. And I think it's the other way around. I mean, deliberative democracy has a lot to learn about how deliberation has been done in social movements for centuries. And in a sense, we are kind of, it's the point that Graham Smith has made in a recent book chapter, saying we should be mindful and careful about hegemonic understandings. And the space for radical democracy in this working group is precisely at the intersection of participatory and deliberative models. And I think we need to keep that and resist prioritizing one practice amongst the others. And I think what we are all asking is, how do we combine these core practices, participation, deliberation, and representation, in ways that get us to where we want to get? And I think that's implicit in Ian's point in a way, because that's the thing. Deliberation as a practice, of course, there is deliberative anarchism and deliberative governance in anarchist spaces or anarchist-inspired spaces, but not necessarily a liberal deliberative democracy. Anyway, I'll stop there. But just to say, I think it's helpful to treat deliberation as a practice and separate that, and that can live in many spaces.
I think Ian's question actually speaks to this question as well. I'm just gonna try to summarize it very, very briefly and bluntly. It's about whether anarchism can be democratic if democracy is actually a mode of regulating things. So a government, and if it's a democratic government, obviously it's a mode of regulating things, and anarchism is more about freedom. So how do the two go together? I'm not sure if I did justice to Ian's question. Yeah. Okay, so we can add this question here. Then let's move on to Michael, please.
Thank you. Good morning, good morning for me, everyone. Good afternoon. It's great to see so many familiar faces and new faces as well. I want to kind of follow up on some of Ian and Oliver's ideas, and because I think what I'm getting confused about is, as we talk about these radical democracy and deliberation and deliberative democracy and anarchist democracy, authoritarian deliberation, and all these sorts of things, is I always get concerned about a bit of conceptual stretching. That we're using terms and we all think we're using them in the exact same way, but it doesn't seem like we are, and therefore I always kind of I didn't think Hay and Warren's article on authoritarian deliberation was right. I don't think they got it right, and the reason is because in the context in which we discuss these things and deliberation, whenever we say deliberation, we have basic understandings that arose from kind of the community in which we live. And when they write about it, what they mean by deliberation is something very different in many ways, it seems to me. And so I think the problem we run into is, therefore, we start to use these in kind of folk term sort of ways. And I'm wondering, is that where some of the confusion in terms of social movements, in terms of anarchist deliberation, in terms of how can we have radical democracy, because we're using these terms in very different ways, and I'm not sure what the solution to that is. I'm not sure if I'm right. I could be completely wrong, and just kind of my mind got set in a certain period of time, and so it's hard for me to shift from that kind of perspective. That's certainly possible, and I don't know what the solution is, but it does seem to me that we are using terms sometimes very differently, and that's where some of the confusion arises.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, Danica, did you have a question?
I think I can just summarize it very briefly. It also would go to William, probably most. I agree that many people who are anarchists or self-identify as anarchists would probably do something like deliberation, but would they do deliberative democracy? I think that's a question that came up in many other contributions as well, so I don't want to repeat that for too long a time.
Okay, thank you, Danica. Last question comes from Dimitri. I don't see any other hands. Dimitri, please unmute yourself.
Okay, hi. Thanks for the presentation. It's good to see people after a long moment without any conferences. I would react. I'm not sure it's a question, but to what Amanda said about Extinction Rebellion putting elite and science forward, and whether citizen assembly are helping democracy or not. I'm not an Extinction Rebellion member, but I have exchanged with them, and I observed the deliberation on climate of the Irish Citizen Assembly 2016-2019, and I'm just finishing observation of the French Citizen Convention on Climate, for climate. And my take would be that elite, reducing scientific or scientific speech to elite might be maybe not the exact way of looking at it. I think the strategy of Extinction Rebellion is to use a specific type of elite and legitimacy of scientists, so an epistocracy against other elites, against the elected, the administrative, the economic elite that are saying we cannot change, and there are other imperative, and therefore they're using a type of elite legitimacy against another one, which in a strategic sense can be on the one hand legitimate, on the other hand can reinforce democracy, because therefore there is no one elite speech that is the truth, but they can be competing ones. And actually in citizen assembly, I think there is a democratization of the scientific expertise, because if you do the deliberation of the many public well, you have to put them in a contradictory way. So there is not something like this expert is the science and the science is absolute. There is a scientific controversy, and you show this controversy by inviting different people, and you connect those two political options. Even though there is a scientific consensus on the problem, which is climate change, you can have competing options about economists that are going to say, I think globalization is to blame, others that are going to say, no, I think it's a problem of innovation, and so on and so forth. So if you show this diversity and this controversy, you can have a way of democratization, because precisely there is no one elite speech. And if you involve ordinary citizens through randomly selected mini publics, you have a way of ordinary citizens should not be cut out of this debate. They have a role to play. It's not just scientific, and we leave them handling our destinies. So I would disagree with that. That would be my way.
Okay, thanks, Dimitri. In the meantime, we have a last question from Graham.
Well, I'm halfway responding to it in the chat. So, can you hear me okay? Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's in response to the question that Ian had about basically, can anarchists, can we have a theory of deliberative democracy? And I'm saying deliberative democracy in response to what Michael just said, from within theories of anarchism. And I'm not just trying to push the philosophical anarchism, but anarchists require an account of collective action, and that account is non-hierarchical. And it is, what's interesting about anarchists is any particular form of government that they create, or form of collective action is always open to undoing, at least the way I understand anarchist practices, which in many ways to me seems to be a very fertile ground for deliberative democracy. So it's really, I think there is actually a really interesting, there is a really interesting line of argument to look here around how deliberative democracy may well provide a solid ground for collective action amongst anarchist collectives. But that was, sorry, I was halfway typing, and that didn't come out as eloquently as my typing would have done.
Thanks, Graham. Okay, So we are at the end of the questions. We are already over time, for which I apologize, but obviously there is more need for questions and debate. So I would just suggest, for the people who have already scheduled other meetings or who just need to go for whatever reasons, you can leave us whenever you feel like it, and we will try to wrap this up in about 10 minutes. I will just add very selfishly another question to all, but it can be ignored. I just want the question to be out there. I noticed that all three presentations today were on on activism and on social movement. So my question is, can radical democracy only be realized through social movements, or other forms, other institutions, other configurations where radical democracy can happen as well? Again, you can ignore this question. I would like to hand over to each of the presenters, and I would ask you to confine yourself to 2 minutes and just try to pick the most interesting question, or maybe 2 questions maximum, but try to keep it short so that we can end at least just with a little bit of overtime. So Will, what are your favorite questions and your answers? You need to unmute yourself.
Well, that just cost me 10 seconds. They're excellent questions. I think the issue about democracy and anarchism is fundamental. If we conceptualize democracy as Ian is suggesting we should, then I think anarchists cannot be deliberative democrats. Some anarchists themselves that I've read hold this view. There are quite a few contemporary anarchists theorizing social movement, radical deliberative practices, saying, don't call this democratic, it's not. And the reason they say that is because they're affirming what Ian is saying. Personally, I tend to agree, actually. I don't like to describe this as anarchist deliberative democracy. I think, to me, conceptually, it makes more sense to just speak of this as anarchist deliberation, much as in the same way that I think we should talk about authoritarian deliberation, and we shouldn't talk about there being deliberative democracy under authoritarianism, which is what I think James Fishkin occasionally presents the situation as. But clearly there's scope for debate here. There are other anarchists who say, no, we are democratic. What we're doing is true democracy. What makes anarchism an interesting challenge to deliberative democracy in many ways is that it fundamentally contests the deliberative democratic assumption that in order to have democracy, you need government. That's why, to me, it's a much more, in a way, a much bigger and more interesting challenge than agonistic democracy. Because agonist Democrats are very interesting, but of course they accept and affirm the necessity of government. I mean, Chantal Mouffe's account is about competition for power in governments. It's about struggling for, so that's the sort of sense in which anarchism changes the goalposts and offers a more fundamental critique. The other questions were great. I wish I could talk more, but again, I don't want to speak too much, so I'll finish there. But yeah, great questions.
Thanks a lot for keeping the time very well. Amanda, what are your favorite questions and answers?
Well, first of all, I've got these headphones on now. Can everyone still hear me? Yeah, good. Okay. Well, Dimitri's question on Extinction Rebellion and deliberation and scientific expertise. Dimitri, I'd be really interested if you could send me some of your own work. I'd be really interested in reading it because it sounds really interesting. Yeah, no, this is what I'm saying. I still haven't kind of worked out what I think, but there's something, and I agree with you, of course, in a citizens' assembly, the idea is to democratize expertise and to bring in different types of experts and scientific experts with local knowledge and local experts and so on. But there's something really suspicious with the fact that lots of people in the climate movement in general and Extinction Rebellion in particular talk about the way that scientists tell us what to do. We just need to, the science is telling us what to do. And there is a big gap between looking at the scientific facts and the data and the knowledge and deciding what to do democratically and politically. And that's the problem I have. And I'm not trying to say that the science isn't crucial or isn't somehow valid. What I'm just suspicious about is that collapsing of the gap. But that's an ongoing discussion. So I don't have a perfect answer for it yet. Yeah, and I think that's what I wanted to add. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk about my work today. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Andrea and Markus.
Yeah, I can just say to Oliver's question, if I got it right, you mean that sometimes we have a tendency to impose these theoretical concepts on a new empirical, or not a new, but a different empirical phenomenon. And so in this case, we should think about deliberation as a practice, something that we can start from identifying the practice, observing the practice, and not just impose these theoretical concepts maybe. And by doing that, recognize also a lot of the deliberation that is going on already. I think actually it speaks a lot to Andrea's ongoing work as well. But I think this is what we're trying to do in the paper. So we're happy to share it with you through email or otherwise. So if it didn't come through in the presentation, that's exactly the point of the paper. So Andrea, I think, wanted to say something to.
When I saw the reference to deliberation as a specific act of communication or concept stretching, I knew it was coming our way, and it's a very legitimate question. I think I'm all about learning from practices, and perhaps we ourselves shouldn't frame it as an attempt to prioritize certain practices over others, but to specify that there is a genuinely deliberative norm to understand movements within deliberative democracy, and we can use it to some extent, perhaps to make sense of these actors. We can do it much more than what we've done so far, and then movements are free to do as they wish, of course. But for us, I think we could push deliberative theory a bit further. Hans, you asked whether there can be other actors being protagonist in radical democracy. I definitely think so. The book by Zizi Papakarisi about digital democracy in the Arab Spring talked about a revolution that took place without movements deliberation, but through acts that were very different from deliberation, and a constellation of actors that is very varied. In my case, I focus on movements because of a disciplinary skill that I have, but it's my limitation. Of course, I think the better, the more mixed the variety of experts we have, the better we can analyze who are the radical actors.
Okay, thank you all for participating in this first webinar. There are many questions probably still open, but also lots of opportunities still to discuss in the future and to collectively think about this. I think it was a very good kickoff of this continued conversation over the summer. Just want to draw attention to the upcoming webinars as well. So in about a week's time on Monday, we'll speak about democracy and institutional reform. Obviously also a very exciting topic, and lots of other webinars coming up. So please do go to the PDD website, and there you will find the button for each individual seminar, webinar to sign up, and you'll get the invitation link then via, okay, stop sharing here. You'll get the invitation link via email. So this was it from us. Thank you so much for all the speakers for taking the time, for sharing their thoughts, for the very valuable insight into their current work, especially also to William, for whom it is quite late in the evening now. So thank you all for participating in the first webinar, and I hope I'll see you here next week.